Welcome, everybody. My name is Laura Zell. I'm the Director of Holocaust Education at the JCRC, and we will get started in just a second.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Kristen Thompson. I've been working with the JCRC on presenting this series, and I'm so grateful that we've got Rebecca Erbelding with us today. So on behalf of the JCRC, welcome to today's session. This is actually our 10th session. We've been going for 2 full weeks now, and a reminder about next week's sessions to please check those out if you'd like to join those if you're not already signed up. Also, the link to the recordings will be emailed to you next week so that you can check back and visit any of those that you missed. Also, please check your email that you'll get from Laura regarding surveys. We greatly appreciate the feedback so far. It's been very helpful, so thank you for that. And during today's session, if you have questions, please make sure that you put those in the chat and we will get to those at the end of today's session. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our wonderful speaker for you today. Rebecca Erbelding is a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where she specializes in American response to the Holocaust. She's worked at the museum since 2003 and holds a PhD in American history from George Mason University. She's also the author of The Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, which won the JDC Herbert Katsky National Jewish Book Award in 2018. And I have a copy of the book, it's fantastic. So with no further ado, Becky, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming on this very interesting historic day. So I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about the museum's exhibit, but more kind of generally about American response as a whole. There has been a lot of new research on America's response to the Holocaust and the response of Americans to the Holocaust in the 1930s and 1940s over the last 10 or so years. And the museum decided in 2014 that this was going to be our 25th anniversary special exhibit. And we kind of knew from the beginning that this was going to be a new story, that we were going to try to tell a new story. For a long time, the scholarship around American response to the Holocaust has really been focused on Roosevelt and on the State Department. What did the president know? What did he do? Or it's been on a few very kind of specific and narrow topics like the voyage of the St. Louis, the ship, or the debate over bombing Auschwitz. And this narrative kind of generalized was about Americans either knowing nothing about what was going on and doing nothing about what was going on about the Holocaust, or Americans knowing everything about the Holocaust and doing nothing about it. And one of the things that I think when you prod that a little bit, you realize is that Americans don't speak with one voice. Americans have never spoken with one voice on any issue. That is kind of who we are as a nation. We fight about things. And Americans fought in the 1930s and 1940s about what was happening to European Jews, about what the nation should do about that. There were massive public debates at the time. And we also knew that Roosevelt was not going to be the only person worth paying attention to. So we wanted to broaden our lens. The president is not the entirety of the government. You have to look at Congress. You have to look at the different departments, the Department of the Treasury, the Labor Department, the State Department. Some of those fought on behalf of Jews while the State Department obstructed some of these efforts. So the mandate of the Holocaust Museum in Washington is to encourage our visitors to ask really difficult questions. So you see 2 questions here that kind of frame this exhibit. What did Americans know, which we try to answer within the exhibit, which I'll talk about a little bit today, and what more could have been done, which we leave for our visitors to ponder and for you to ponder after we go through some of this history. So one of the things that we also decided very early on is that we weren't going to rely on hindsight. That's really difficult when you're talking about the Holocaust, because we all know the end of the story. We know about killing centers. We know that 6 million Jews will be murdered. And so we have to remember that in the 1930s, they did not know that. Even the Nazis did not know that in the 1930s, that this was going to be the outcome. So when you look at news events about the early Nazi persecution of German Jews in 1933, you want to scream at everyone and say, do something, do it now, save them now. But the people who are involved in all of these decisions, they don't know that the Holocaust is to come. And so you really have to root it in the context of the time pretty rigorously to actually understand what the possibilities were, what the likelihoods were, and what these debates were really all about. They weren't necessarily about mass murder. They are about persecution. Mass murder, for a lot of this history, hasn't happened yet. And so the context of the period is kind of a tightrope, because you want to provide context without making it seem like you're providing an excuse for inaction. We don't want to excuse what did not happen, but you can't look at these historical debates in isolation. And we need to think about why people felt the way they did. And this history can be told in a lot of different ways. You can look at it through the lens of isolationism, through the memory of World War I, which was very fresh in Americans' minds in the 1920s. It made Americans really cautious to engage overseas. It made them suspicious of foreigners that they thought could drag them into war. It also, was capped off by a global pandemic in 1918 and 1919, which was blamed on foreigners. It was blamed on the Spanish flu. And so it made Americans to suspect that bad things happened overseas, that if we stayed within our territorial borders, if we stayed on our side of the ocean, things would be better. It also made Americans really distrustful of reports of atrocities abroad, because there were rumors during World War I of atrocities that they then believed after the war to have been untrue. It's also the story of immigration. Who is allowed to come and when and how, and the ways in which immigration and race and anti-Semitism play into that. And I'll talk a little bit about immigration once we get to the 1930s. And of course, you can look at this history through the lens of racism and anti-Semitism too. This constant tension over who gets the benefits of being an American. This debate that really has lasted through the entirety of our nation's history. So how Americans are protesting the treatment of German Jews in a society where African Americans are not equal, and where there are quotas against Jews in colleges, at golf clubs, at hotels that barred non-Aryans in this country. So all of that is happening in the lens of how Americans and when Americans are seeing what Germans are doing to German Jews at the time. So there's a debate going on within the Jewish community in the United States over how much they can push, whether they are willing to risk a rise in anti-Semitism in the United States for pushing for something that was perceived as a Jewish interest, a Jewish story. It is also the story of a nation that's really in the midst of a global, serious economic crisis. In 1933, when Roosevelt becomes president, it's 4 years into the Depression. It's the same time that Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. And at that time, 25% of the American workforce is unemployed. Immigrants are seen as potential job takers. And most Americans are much more focused on the domestic recovery than they are on any sort of crisis that's happening abroad. So our exhibition unfolds really in 4 chapters, which I'll kind of walk you through because they echo the chronology of the history. So the first one goes from 1933 to 1938, where we ask, what did Americans know about this? What did they know about the rise of Hitler? What did they know about the early persecution of Jewish Germans? This was critical for us to address because you can't assume or expect people to react to something if you can't show that they actually knew about it or had information about it. We actually found that Americans had a lot of information in the early 1930s about what was happening to Jewish Germans. These 2 covers are both from the one on the left that you can see, the Vanity Fair, is actually from November 1932. So Hitler is not even in power yet. He has not yet been named Chancellor of Germany. This is 2 months before that. But what this shows us is that the artists at Vanity Fair assume that you as an American know enough about this history that they can do a parody of Hitler and you will know what they're talking about. You will know the symbol of the swastika representing the Nazi Party. The one on the right is from 1936. It has Hitler on the cover. They are on the cover of dozens of magazines. Hitler, Goebbels is on the cover of Time magazine in July 1933 after he's named as the Nazi propaganda minister. And this little quote at the bottom says, "Say it in your dreams, the Jews are to blame." So from the beginning, Americans who are looking overseas at what is happening in Germany, what is happening with the Nazi Party, know that this Nazi Party is tied irrevocably with anti-Semitism. They know that that is at the crux of the Nazi Party. We wanted, though, to kind of expand a little bit beyond this to say, well, what if you didn't subscribe to any of these national newspapers? What if you didn't read the New York Times? What if you didn't read the Washington Post? What if you were looking at local newspapers? So we started a nationwide newspaper collection campaign called History Unfolded. You can go to the website down here if you want to, newspapers.ushmm.org, and you can explore local newspaper coverage. You can participate in the project too. So if you are looking for some sort of digital history project to participate in at home, or you're a teacher who is interested in potentially incorporating this into your classroom, we have a full-time community manager that can help you figure out a way to incorporate this into what you're doing with your students. But what it is we ask people to go into their local newspapers, to look at microfilm, to look at online sources or digitized sources, and to share articles related to certain events. Since the project launched, we've gotten 35,000 submissions from all over the country, including, and when you're in the exhibit, you can actually touch any state and see some of this early newspaper coverage of early persecution of Jewish Germans. But some of the things that people have found. So this is the St. Cloud Daily Times from St. Cloud, Minnesota, Saturday, April 1st, 1933. And I love looking at these front page newspapers. April 1st is the day that the Nazis boycotted Jewish-owned stores throughout Nazi Germany. But you can see what's going on. It's the beginning of the Holy Year in Rome, and there's a picture of the Prime Minister of Great Britain being received by Benito Mussolini in Italy. You can see that it's the end of Prohibition and the beginning of beer sales in the United States. That there's a picture of Joseph Goebbels, the future propaganda minister, on the cover of this local newspaper, and a big article about the Germans starting a boycott of the Jewish race. This boycott is announced in advance. That is another thing that we found in these newspapers, is that a lot of times it's a multi-day story leading up to the boycott. The Americans know it is going to happen, and they are waiting for April 1st to see how it goes. That is consistent throughout papers throughout the United States. It is not just in the big papers, it is in the local papers. And these stories about boycotts, about Jews being kicked out of the civil service, about the burning of books in Nazi Germany, it actually all did resonate with the American people. There are marches and rallies in at least 65 different cities nationwide in the spring and summer of 1933. And there's a petition movement. If you go to the National Archives, to the State Department records, you can find over 500 petitions from all over the country of people writing into the State Department or to the new president, to Franklin Roosevelt, asking him to do something. I found this one. This is from the Jewish students of the University of Minnesota, submitted their own petition with their condemnation of the reversion to medieval barbarism and narrow race prejudices, which have characterized the actions of the Nazi Party in Europe. The trouble with this is that Americans historically also have a short attention span. So by the summer of 1933, the story was starting to fall off the front pages. Americans start refocusing on domestic issues, on the New Deal, on the Great Depression, which is still going on. And so they stop focusing really on what is happening to Jewish Germans. And this protest movement never becomes a real kind of sustained nationwide movement. So the next question that we ask really is what did Americans do during a refugee crisis? Did they aid Jewish refugees? And the answer again is really mixed. This section in the exhibit starts with a paper wall, which you can see here, of a lot of the different documents that you would need to get out of Nazi Germany and into the United States as an immigrant. One of the crucial pieces of this history, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that Americans and the United States has no refugee policy. So this is not a time where you can come as a refugee or a migrant or seek asylum the way that you can now. Those pieces of our laws came after the Holocaust and to some extent in response to the Holocaust. But at this point, you can only enter as an immigrant. And that is a very slow and deliberate process. And these were not ordinary times. It is a slow, deliberate process not meant for people escaping persecution who may need to get out of a country quickly. This system has never changed throughout this period. We show American response to the Kristallnacht attacks, to the pogroms in November 1938, which are, I guess, next week is the anniversary of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is the largest and longest sustained newspaper coverage of any event related to the persecution of Jews. It is front page news in the United States for about 3 weeks. And you can see why this is striking. Kristallnacht actually happened 2 days after the congressional midterm elections of 1938, in which the Democrats maintained their majority, but the GOP made significant gains in Congress and began to plan for their hope to retake the presidency in 1940. So you see that that's the main headline, but right above it is worst anti-Jewish riots sweep Germany. And the entire left-hand side of the page are these reports out of Germany. This will stay a front page story really for most of the month. Another thing that we did in the exhibit and that I think is really interesting when you're looking at this history is that the 1930s was really the first decade of public opinion polling. This is when George Gallup is getting the Gallup polls started in 1935. And so we really tried to take advantage of that to see, you know, not just what people are seeing in the paper, but how they felt about the things that they were reading. And these polls really, I think, sum up some of this history. So in November 1938, it's about 3 weeks after Kristallnacht, which, like I said, has been on the front page. Gallup asks a group of people, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? And 94% of the people they polled disapprove of what the Nazis are doing. The same group of people were then asked, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% of people say no. So this gap between sympathy and the willingness to be part of the solution really, I think, runs over this entire history. Americans know what is happening often. They are sympathetic to the victims, but they are not willing to allow more people to come to the United States. This is the section of the exhibit where a lot of the new research emerges, this section on the refugee crisis. So we discussed US immigration law, which I got at a little bit a minute ago, and the number of visas issued to people who were born in Germany. US immigration is really structured through the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924. I think often people assume that US law changed to prevent Jewish immigrants in the 1930s from entering the United States. That's not true. There are no new laws either to let more Jews in or keep Jews out in the 1930s. They didn't need those laws because they had the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which already made it incredibly difficult to come to the United States. It established quotas based on a person's country of birth. So overall immigration was capped at about 153,000 people per year. And then that 153,000 was divvied up by country. And it was based in eugenics. It was based in the false pseudoscience of eugenics, the idea that some people are better than others, some countries create better immigrants than others. And so the so-called good countries got a far higher percentage of that 153,000 than countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, where they considered bad immigrants to come from. And those, of course, were countries that were largely Slavic, had large Jewish populations and large Catholic populations. Germany actually had the second highest quota of any country in the world. It was considered a good place to come from. And so in that sense, German Jews were actually lucky to have been born in Germany and able to take advantage of that quota. By 1938, after Germany took over Austria, they had 27,370 visas available per year. Of course, that is not nearly as many as the number of people who are applying to immigrate, which by 1939 had reached 300,000 people. So an 11-year wait at that point to immigrate to the US. The other thing that this law does, this 1924 law, is it transfers decisions to State Department officials where you are. So the diplomats at the embassies and the consulates overseas. So this law ends Ellis Island as your port of entry. It ends this idea that we have in our heads of people coming to Ellis Island, presenting their papers and getting allowed, hopefully, to enter the United States. Now you have to wait. You have to wait in Europe for your turn to come up, to get your visa, to present your paperwork. And that is a very dangerous situation, of course, for people who are under threat. So this period, really starting in 1938, is a period of a refugee crisis. Like I said, hundreds of thousands of people are trying to get out, and they face a very daunting experience. These are some of the documents that you would need to get out of Europe and into the United States. You need a visa application. You need documents of anything that your government has on you. So this is marriage certificates, birth certificates, military discharge papers. You often needed to be on a waiting list. You can see a waiting list number here. This is a pretty early waiting list number. So you can see that Helena Meyer is 9,443rd in line in Stuttgart. Each consulate had its own waiting list. So by the end of the year, you can see numbers for Berlin where people are 45,000th in line. You need medical clearances from a State Department approved physician. You need often a sponsor in the United States who would vouch for you and say that you would never become a public charge. This was something that was added, not added during the Great Depression, but really enforced during the Great Depression, that you could not need any sort of public support. And so that person, the American who is sponsoring you, has to submit tax forms. They have to submit letters from prominent citizens in their community saying that you're a good American and that you're not going to abandon the person that you sponsor if they're allowed to come here. It is a very serious and difficult process. Roosevelt recognized that this was a crisis pretty early on after the Nazis took over Austria in March 1938. He called an international conference at Evian in France. 32 nations came to this conference, and 32 nations, including the United States, basically said this is not really our problem, that we are not going to change our immigration laws. Some countries in South America actually shut down to immigration soon thereafter, getting worried that the conference itself was going to push them to accept Jewish immigrants. So you can see the Washington Post, the yes, but attitude perils progress at the World Refugee Conference. And then, of course, a year later, Europe goes to war. And the war also adds another layer of difficulty for people who are trying to get out to the United States. We really kind of went back and forth about how to tell the story of the St. Louis, the famous ship that was bringing Jewish refugees from Germany to Cuba. Those people had Cuban landing certificates. They did not have US immigration visas. And the Cuban government turned them away. the United States decided not to allow them entry because they did not have US visas, and we didn't want to create any sort of precedent. But it's really an anomaly story, that story. It is the only ship that is turned away from the United States carrying Jewish refugees. So we did an experiment of looking at the number of ships, the sheer number of ships bringing self-identified Jewish refugees to the United States, and how this changes because of the war. So this, I'm going to try to show you a very brief video clip of what it looked like in 1938. Sorry, I'll turn the volume off. So you can see that there are dozens of ships coming from all over Europe. All of these ships are carrying self-identified Jewish refugees. So throughout the 1938, right after the Nazis took Austria, there are people coming every month. By 1941, however, after Europe has been at war for almost 2 years, this is what, this is what it looks like. So you can see here that all of these ports have shut down to US bound transportation, that once an area comes under Nazi control, people can't leave on passenger ships. There are warships trolling the Atlantic, submarines attacking passenger ships and attacking ships that they think might be carrying any sort of war goods. And so it becomes very difficult to cross the Atlantic. And for people who are deep inside Nazi controlled territory, it's very difficult to find a place where you can get on a ship and get out. For most people, Lisbon is their port of entry. But that means if you're in Berlin, you have to go through France and Spain and Portugal at the bare minimum and get all of the necessary entry and exit visas, all of which cost money, all of which had to be gathered in specific orders. And so immigration really does become minimal at this point, not just because it is more difficult to get to the United States, but because it is much more difficult to get out of Europe in the process. So the next section of the exhibit covers 1939 to 1941, this more than 2-year period during World War II in which the United States is neutral. After Germany invades Poland in 1939 in September, Britain and France, of course, declare war. And Roosevelt responds to this by saying that the United States is going to remain a neutral nation. Isolationism is still incredibly popular. The US passes isolation bills in 1935, 1937, and 1939. They make it even illegal for Americans to travel on ships that are owned by nations at war, with the idea that if the ship is attacked at sea and goes down, you as the American on board could be responsible for bringing our nation into war. So in May 1940, after the Nazis invade Western Europe, 93% of Americans still oppose joining the war proactively. The FBI, after the Nazis take France, I'm trying to find my mouse here. Yeah, after the Nazis take France, in June 1940, after France surrenders, Americans really have a soul searching, because the war seemed really far away when it was just Germany and Poland. But once France falls, Americans realize that Great Britain is the only bulwark between Nazi Germany and the United States, and they get incredibly scared. In part, they fear that Nazi Germany has been placing spies and saboteurs inside the United States, just waiting to bring the country down the second that they cross the border, or the second that they defeat Great Britain. They're going to immediately come and land on our shores. We also, at this point in time, have the 17th largest military in the world. America is not a military superpower. We had been isolationist for 2 decades, to the point of destroying our warships and saying we are never going to go to war again. We don't need these things. So Americans are very suddenly fearful that we are not going to be able to defend our territory. The FBI starts to frankly ginning up fear of immigrants and fear that of this 5th column, this idea of spies and saboteurs. So you can see this FBI warning about the war of spies and saboteurs. And there's also this spate of newspaper and magazine articles about the potential that new immigrants could be spies. Roosevelt even gets in on this. In June 1940 at a press conference, he says that even Jewish immigrants could be spies, that they don't want to be, of course, but that the Nazis might be holding their family members hostage back in Europe in exchange for these acts of spying and sabotage. And so the State Department puts new restrictions on immigration. At one point, they make it, or they refuse to grant visas to anybody who still has close family members inside Nazi territory. And of course, that makes it incredibly difficult for people to escape. You also see that really up until and after Pearl Harbor, Americans are having this debate of what are we fighting for? What are we going to fight for? There's the America First organization that is saying we need to just defend our homeland. We have to make it clear that we are not interested in going abroad. They're fighting with other organizations. The Fight for Freedom was an organization that pushed for proactive US entry into the war. And there's an organization called the CDAAA, the Committee to Defend America by Aiding Our Allies, which fought for the Lend-Lease. It fought for increased support. You know, let's help Britain and then eventually the Soviet Union. Let's help them defeat the Nazis over there so that we don't have to get involved in the war over here. But if we have to, we should probably go. And what you see is after the US does enter the war, a lot of the propaganda focuses on the threat to democracy. It focuses on the Nazis as the enemies of Christianity, as the enemies of American liberal democracy. This is not a war that we fight for Jews. It is not a war that we fight to help Jews. It is not a war that we fight because the Nazis are threatening Jews. The Holocaust really has nothing to do with why the United States goes to war. We go to war because of the threat that Nazis imposes to everyone, and most specifically, because we are attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese and Nazi Germany declares war on us. And so we declare war back. That is how the US goes to war. For most of 1942, and this is the last section of the exhibit, we look at how Americans reacted to the Holocaust. So in 1942, at the end of 1942, Americans learned for the first time that the Nazis have a plan. The Nazis and their collaborators have a plan, and that plan involves trying to murder all of the Jews of Europe. There was some evidence of this in 1940 and in 1941, especially after the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. And most Americans dismissed those newspaper articles. They dismissed those rumors. They figured it was just propaganda. You know, how do you get an isolationist nation to go to war? You talk about how evil the enemy is. You talk about how they murder women and children. And so a lot of Americans just chalked it up to that. You know, why would the Nazis be diverting resources to trying to murder innocent people who aren't a threat to them? It didn't make sense to many Americans who did not understand Nazi worldview. And so it takes really an uncomfortably long time, I think, for Americans to understand what is happening and to believe that the Holocaust is in fact happening. Historians really debate or date the arrival of news of the Holocaust, news that was finally believed by the government and by the mass media, to the Regner telegram in August 1942. Gerhard Regner was the secretary of the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland. And in August 1942, he learned third hand from a German businessman that the Nazis had this plan. He tried to send it through this message through the State Department in Washington to Stephen Wise, the most famous rabbi in America, someone who knew President Roosevelt, figuring if Wise knows what is happening, Wise will go to Roosevelt. The two of them together will come up with some sort of plan to deal with this. The State Department actually blocks Regner's message. They refuse to deliver it to Stephen Wise because they say this is just a war rumor. There's no sense in getting people riled up. This is just, people are just going to be fearful for this. There's no evidence that it's true. By the end of November, though, the evidence has come in. The State Department has talked to the Swiss, they've talked to the Red Cross, they've talked to the Vatican, and they finally confirmed to Stephen Wise who had gotten the message through Western Union after the official channels failed. Some people in Britain tried to send it to Wise through the mail, through Western Union telegrams. That is how he got to it. So by the end of November, it is public information. Wise has confirmed to the press that this is happening and that at least 2 million Jews have already been murdered. The US and Great Britain and the Soviet Union decide that there is nothing that they can do about this. There's no sense in trying to format any sort of rescue plan. Instead, what these countries are going to do is they're going to condemn what they call the cold-blooded extermination, and they're going to promise to hold war crimes trials after the war. That is what Allied response is going to be, is threatening the perpetrators with post-war punishment. To some extent, there's a little bit of validity to this, because November 1942, when this news comes out, is also the month that the Allies land in North Africa. So they are thousands of miles away from the killing centers where most people are being murdered at this point. But 1943 is really a lost year. More and more information is coming out of Europe about what is happening, and the US continues to have no solid plan to deal with it. There is more and more pressure throughout 1943 on the US to do something. There are pageants and rallies throughout the country pushing for some sort of American response. Nobody is quite sure what that response should be, but we should be doing something. There's even an Orthodox rabbi's march on the US Capitol in October 1943, pushing for an American response. At this point in the story, the Treasury Department really enters the picture. The Treasury Department, which controlled US sanctions. World War II is the first war in which the US has economic sanctions on our enemies, which of course is largely the way that we wage war today, is through economic sanctions. But back then it was new, and they did not know how to deal with humanitarian aid. And so in the summer of 1943, the people who are dealing with US economic sanctions get a request from the World Jewish Congress to send humanitarian aid to Jews in France and Romania. And they look at the proposal, they debate it for a while, and they finally decide, we could do this. It's not going to interfere with the war effort. Even if the Nazis seize a little bit of this humanitarian aid, it's not going to change the direction of the war. And so they decide that they'll let this through. The State Department consistently starts to obstruct what they're doing. They refuse to send the telegrams giving the permission. They start to consult with the British, and the British say no to this idea. And the Treasury Department gets more and more frustrated by the State Department's refusal to provide any sort of aid. And so the Treasury Department ultimately goes to Roosevelt and says the State Department is obstructing US response to the Holocaust. They write a memo which is originally titled on the acquiescence of this government in the murder of the Jews, which accuses the US government of being complicit in the murder of the Jews of Europe. If we don't do something now, we will forever be partially responsible for the Holocaust. You can see here, this is one of the later drafts. One of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated. The State Department has grossly procrastinated. It is clear that Hitler has a policy of extermination. We have talked, we have sympathized, we have expressed our horror. The time to act is long past due. So they go to Roosevelt and they convince him to remove refugee matters from the State Department and to grant them to a newly created government agency called the War Refugee Board. The War Refugee Board is the first time the US has a policy about the Holocaust, and it is a policy of rescue and relief. It operates from January 1944 till September 1945, a few months after the end of the war. And they estimate that they save tens of thousands of lives. They do many, many things. As Kristen mentioned, I wrote a book on the War Refugee Board. So if you're interested in them, I can give you the title of the book. But one of the things that they do is they open a refugee camp in upstate New York. The War Refugee Board was really pushing the neutral nations of Europe, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, to allow more refugees over their borders. And those countries were coming back and saying, why should we allow Jews over our borders if you won't take any yourselves? So they open a refugee camp in Oswego, New York, a small town on Lake Ontario, and they bring about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees from Allied occupied Italy to live there. They are housed there until the end of 1945, even long after the war is over. And the kids attend public school, but they are still kept behind barbed wire in a small town in upstate New York. Our exhibit ends really with the end of the war in Europe, though. We debated how to end the exhibit. Endings are always hard. Do you end with the displaced persons camps? Do you end with war crimes trials? Do you end with human rights laws that come out of the Holocaust? But this is a story of Americans and the Holocaust, and the Holocaust ends with the end of the war in Europe, the official Holocaust. So General Eisenhower tours Ohrdruf, the newly liberated Ohrdruf concentration camp, in April 1945, on April 12th. That is the same day that in Warm Springs, Georgia, Franklin Roosevelt dies. Roosevelt does not live to see images of liberation. But one of the things that Eisenhower does is he asks journalists, congressmen, other soldiers to come and witness, saying that he doesn't want the Holocaust to ever become propaganda. The war ends, of course, in early May 1945, at the same time that, for the first time, Americans are seeing visual evidence of the Holocaust, seeing for the first time, as in the words of many soldiers, what they were fighting for. Of course, this is not the way that the war was framed for them, but many soldiers weren't sure why they were fighting until they liberated concentration camps and then decided that this is really what they had been fighting for this whole time. So there are a number of really big enduring questions that I think go through this history. How can we understand this gap between sympathy and the willingness to act? How can we bridge the gap? Because that is still a gap that exists today. How do we bridge it when we confront atrocities and genocides that continue to happen? Why do some Americans choose to act while others choose not to? Why is there such a big gap between our humanitarian ideals and the political realities that we face? So these are some of the questions that we want people to think about. And before I take your questions, I just want to show a few ways that if you want to learn more, we've got you covered. So the museum has a very robust web exhibit that goes through a lot of this history. You can look at, it's ushmm.org/Americans. You can look at artifacts, you can look at newspaper articles, you can look at videos. Almost all of the films we show in the exhibit are online, some of them repurposed for teachers. We also have a number of different interactives, like what did refugees need to obtain a US visa in the 1930s? So if you have someone who went through this experience, a Jewish immigrant relative of yours who came in the 1930s, you can look and see examples of the documents that they would have needed with translations. So you can see exactly what they likely would have needed to have. We also have how many refugees came to the United States from 1933 to 1945. So we look at the numbers of people who are coming from Germany, who had been born in Germany, and how those numbers change over time and why. We also partnered with the American Library Association. The traveling version of this exhibit was supposed to hit public libraries nationwide last March, but other things happened last March in the United States. And so the tour is a bit on hold until next year, but it will be traveling, including to Michigan, to Minnesota, to North Dakota. We would love it if you wanted to go see it. The tour schedule as it stands now is on the American Library Association website, or I can get it to whomever needs it. And finally, in the winter of 2022, so like January-ish 2022, there will be, at this point, a 3-part documentary done by Ken Burns on the topic of Americans in the Holocaust. Right now, I think they're planning on a 6-hour film on this topic. And so that's something I'm very interested to see what they do with it. And I think it should be really interesting and hopefully raise some of these questions, these really, I think, enduring questions that go throughout American history, but maybe are particularly powerful when you look at it with the context of the Holocaust. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and see what kind of questions you all have about this kind of complicated history that we raced through. So I'm going to look at the chat. Oh, you have a friend who is at the camp in Oswego? That's very cool. Thank you, Barbara. Does anybody have any questions?
That was a lot of great information, Becky. I'm maybe biased, but I could listen to you all day. So I'm
Thanks.
sure people are processing a little bit, but please go ahead and put your questions in the chat.
I've covered it. I've done it all. We did it. Oh, Gloria Fredkove. Okay, yeah. She was Yolanda Bass. Her brother was there too, and her mother. Gloria, there's this beautiful photo that was in Life magazine of the Bass family when the refugees at Fort Ontario arrived. It was big news in the US. I mean, the War Refugee Board really tried to publicize it, in part because they wanted Americans to see refugees and to see that, you know, kind of the refugees, they're just like us. And on the page of, was it Life magazine? Yeah, it was Life magazine. There's a photo of Yolanda's mother, Ava. Gloria is her name now, but her mother, Ava, holding her, and her brother, who I think was about 11 years old, standing in the background. They had had a horrific experience before coming to the US, sleeping on the sides of roads, and really, really struggled. And so it's a really powerful story, the Bass family. Yes, articles can be researched for certain states. So what you can do is go to the History Unfolded website, which is newspapers.ushmm.org. There's a little kind of 3 lines. It looks like a little hamburger patty in the top right-hand corner. And if you hit that, there's Explore User Research, and you can research by event, you can research by date, you can research by where in the paper it was, you can research by the name of the newspaper, and you can research by state. So definitely go there. For things that are on newspapers.com, for newspapers that are digitized, you will be able to see the paper itself. We got a deal with them, so even if you are not a subscriber to newspapers.com, you'll still be able to see the full paper. Yes, there was a film on Oswego that aired on PBS last year. Yes, there was. I find the Oswego story absolutely fascinating. I grew up in Rochester, which is about an hour and a half from Oswego, and I did not know the story of the refugee camp at all growing up, but they now have a really nice museum there. It's a beautiful space and a beautiful area of the country for about 5 months a year. And the rest of the time it's very, very snowy, and that very much shocked the refugees who were told that, who had come from Italy, and were told that they were going to a nice place with a good climate, and then they went to upstate New York. Yes, and Ruth Gruber's book is absolutely incredibly important. Her papers, her son just donated her papers. So I'm interested to get into those at some point. I don't know. I mean, I think Americans have learned some things about this history. There certainly was, especially after the war, a response to it. I mean, there's a human rights convention. There are refugee and asylum and migration laws that weren't in place back then. I think no one on any side of the political aisle thinks those laws are working. And so I think we do need to have a national conversation about what we mean when we talk about refugees, what we mean when we talk about asylum seekers and migrants, and where we stand on those things. I know there's a huge refugee population in Minnesota, and that it's a very welcoming place for refugees. That's not true in a lot of areas of the country. And so I think that's one place where we have both learned from this history in good ways and potentially in bad ways. But I think there is also a really oversimplified idea of American response to the Holocaust. I think we look back and we say it was so easy to know what to do. They were faced with this genocide. We definitely should have stepped in and saved everybody. But then we look at genocides today. We look at the Rohingya, we look at the Uyghurs in China, and we say, you know what, it's really complicated and we don't know what to do. And there are all of these factors we need to consider. And I think one of the things that we need to realize is that there were all of these factors that people were considering back then. And we look back and we lament that they didn't do more. And I think we need to have some self-reflection in that, not because I think we're wrong to lament that they didn't do more, but that we should be doing more now. We should be thinking about and talking about and figuring out what we can do to do more. Barry asked, was there much political difference between the Democrats and the GOPs related to Jewish refugees and rescue? Not really. This is one of the interesting things, is that in the 1930s and 40s, the Democrats maintained a majority in Congress, in the Senate, in the House. They had the presidency for 12 years, but the Democratic Party was not unified. The Democratic Party was really starting to split between Southern Democrats who had been entrenched in power since the Civil War and controlled basically the South, and controlled because they had been entrenched and because committees are based on seniority. They really controlled all of the committees of Congress, were Southern Democrats. They are pro-Jim Crow, they are anti-immigration by and large. Compare that with Northern Democrats who are starting to court African-American votes, immigrant votes. That's the FDR wing of the party. And so it's one of the reasons that you have a Democratic Party in 1935 that can't pass an anti-lynching law, that can't allow refugees in, because you have a vast wing of the party that is staunchly against those things. And Roosevelt and the calculations that the administration makes are that the domestic issues need to take precedent. And so they basically say, we need those Southern Democrats for the New Deal. And so we can't compromise, we can't push them on immigration and risk losing their support, risk them going over to the Republicans. So you would think that politically Roosevelt could have gotten more done. And I think he could have probably used a lot more political capital to push people. He had a lot of political power, but he doesn't necessarily always, often, really. And in part because of this split within his own party, I think. I'm sorry, I could keep talking for a long time, but I'd rather talk about things you want to talk about if there's anything else you want to cover. And if not, you know, there are lots of really good books on this topic, and I would definitely encourage you to check out the museum's website. We have a lot on there and have really beefed up kind of the ways in which we tell this very complicated story. It is not a simple one. Oh, thanks, Jeff. That's very nice. Thank you, everybody.
We'll give it another minute or so and see if there are any last questions. But while we're doing that, just a reminder that on Monday, we're talking about rescue and resistance. And so if you haven't signed up for next week's courses and you want to, please go ahead back to the JCRC's website and make sure that you do that. And again, you'll be getting an email about the link to the recording of this session as well as the others from this week and more information about a survey as well. And Becky, we're just so grateful for your time today. We really appreciate it. You have such a wealth of knowledge and it's just fascinating to listen to you today. So thanks for that. And we'll see if any last minute questions come in. And if not, it's been kind of a heavy week for everybody. And so happy Friday. And I hope you all enjoy this beautiful weather for the weekend. And thanks again, Becky. It was great to see you and catch up. Great
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.